Hello, listeners. Welcome to the What is Nerd podcast. I am your host, Tyler Dietz. I'm here with my buddy, Nick Grant. How's it going, Nick?
Hey, man, it's going pretty good.
I'm also here with JP Cochran. How you doing?
Doing pretty well.
Now, between the three of us, we represent a wide spectrum of nerdiness, from myself up at the top to JP down at the bottom and Nick somewhere in between. The point of this show is to serve as an introduction and overview of all things that are widely considered to be nerdy entertainment. This includes, but is not limited to, comic books, anime, video games, board games, and many mediums of science fiction and fantasy. Before we get started, if you enjoy the show, please like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at WhatIsNerd1 with no question mark. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or Google Play. Leave us a rating or review if you are able. Also, check out our sister show, What is Sports? And finally, if you have any questions or comments, send us an email at winerdcast@gmail.com. So, today, y'all ready to talk about comic books?
I'm always ready to talk about comic books.
Always.
I'm ready to learn about comic books.
That's what we're here for.
JP, we'll start with you. How much comic books have you read in your life?
I have read zero comic. I've never.
You've never read?
I don't think I've read a word out of a comic book.
You've never
before.
read have you read Calvin and Hobbes before?
Or are these do they have bits of comic books in the newspaper? That would be the comics.
The funnies,
The
yeah,
funnies.
Or the comics, yeah.
Okay, well that's the only comics I've read.
Garfield.
And I never. I don't know. I probably never really got into comic books because. As a kid, I didn't really understand it.
They let you down?
Yeah.
How about you, Nick? What was your relationship with comic books growing up?
It wasn't, to be honest, I didn't really read a whole lot. I was aware of them. Obviously, they're pretty popular. I had some friends that read them. My cousin, he was big into comics. I think throughout my life, I've read a few. I didn't really go out and buy them because the town I grew up in, there wasn't really a comic book store, so I didn't have easy access to them.
Yeah, well, I kind of grew up with a few comic books. I didn't read them that much. I feel like that people of our generation who kind of grew up in the 90s, comic books weren't really much of a thing that kids did, right? I feel like that was maybe a thing that the generation before us read a lot of. Because most people that I know that are into comic books, they got into them whenever they're older, in middle school or high school or something like that. But I feel like the little kids didn't really read comic books that much.
Yeah, I mean, as a little kid, you'd have to pull my teeth or twist my arm to have me read in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and also, let's say that you like the X-Men if you're a little kid. I mean, in the 90s, you probably didn't get much exposure to X-Men through the comics. You probably got it through the cartoon show, right? Same with Spider-Man and all that stuff, right, Nick?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and arcade games.
Comics are an interesting thing to cover because they are a important part of nerd culture, but
And pop culture, too.
I mean, because I would more say that it's not the comics themselves, it's the characters.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially now, are a huge part of pop culture. So that's why I kind of wanted to hit up some of this, some of the essential things to know about comics. Me, myself, I didn't read a lot of them. I kind of actually got most of my comics that I ever owned, at once. I think my aunt or uncle just bought me a ton of comic books for Christmas one year. And we'll get to the way the comics were in the 90s, but, I mean, comic book readers, if you're listening to this, you probably already know, comic books in the 90s weren't really for kids. They were violent and extreme, and so a lot of the comics that I got, it's my relative was just oh, he's a kid, let's get him a comic book, and it turns out that people were getting their heads chopped off and stuff, and they just had no idea.
Well, that's part of the fun.
Exactly, yeah, it's what you can get away with. Just kind of a rundown of the comic books format, right? Because JP, I know that a lot of this is brand new to you. Nick, you might know some of this stuff already, but comic books, they are released on a monthly basis. Start with that, right?
Oh, yeah, that's news to me.
You didn't know that.
Comic books are released on a monthly,
it's like a magazine subscription. So you can get a subscription to, let's say, Batman, and every month they'll send you the new Batman comic, the new issue of Batman. Or you can pick them up at your comic book store. I know that Barnes & Noble also has comic books on the newsstand, but yeah, it's just
okay. Wow. So the life of these superheroes is still being written.
Yes. And that's so Batman has been alive since like the 1940s or whatever, and it's just, I mean, they reboot the stories, and sometimes they'll kill off a character to start a new version of the superhero, but oftentimes it's an ongoing, never-ending story, basically. In some issues, there's a thing called a one-shot, which is a single special issue. Also, you can get comic books in trade paperbacks, which if you go to the bookstore and you look in the comics section or the graphic novel section, usually it's these collections of previously published comic book issues that are collected together, because comics will cover like a story arc, so they might collect all the issues of one story arc and put them into a single kind of volume that you can buy and read. And honestly, if you're going to read comics, I recommend that's the way to do it. Because if you're reading it on a monthly basis, which I've tried doing a couple times, it's impossible to remember what you read like a month ago, right?
Yeah, and that's one thing. One of my complaints with comic books is that while they're pretty entertaining, there's not a whole lot of story, and you'll be over before you know it, and then you have to wait so long or go back to the store and get the other issue.
Yeah.
And talking about these paperback collections, whenever The Walking Dead first came out for Christmas, my brother got me the first volume of The Walking Dead comics, and that was great, so I could read like the first several storylines.
Was that really thick one?
Yes,
that
yeah.
had like the first 100 issues or whatever?
Right, yeah, and it was really cool because compared to the show, it was basically the first 2 seasons of the show, and I could read it, and it actually took me a little while to read through it, and I agree, I mean, it was great, because I actually felt like I was reading a book almost, as opposed to sitting down for 5 minutes and flipping through a comic book.
Yeah, so that's kind of the best way, I think. It's kind of like whenever, Nick, you remember this, whenever, those Telltale games.
Oh, yeah.
Because they would, I don't even know if they still release those, but so they did the Walking Dead series, and then the Wolf Among Us series that was based off the Fable comic books, but they would release those like a month at a time, and every time if I tried to play it like the month that they came out, I would forget what was going on. So it's actually much more enjoyable to get the whole thing at once. Like you wouldn't watch like 5 minutes of a movie at a time. You'd watch the whole thing, right?
Right.
So, but what you described, Nick, the idea of reading a single comic book volume for a long time, that's what you call a graphic novel. They are a complete, long story that are meant to be bought and consumed all at once.
Yeah, going off of graphic novels, I know there's a lot of anime that are in that format as well. I remember whenever I'd visit Barnes & Noble, I'd always go to the graphic novel section, and I was a huge fan of Dragon Ball Z. And so I would flip through that, and I bought several little graphic novels of some DBZ stuff. And, of course, I'd seen everything on the TV show, but it was fun to actually read and see it in a comic
Were they
form.
Were they the ones where you had to flip backwards?
Yes.
Like,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
I forgot about that. Yeah. It was like reversed. It was weird.
Do you know about that, JP?
No.
Yeah, because that's the Japanese manga. Those are the Japanese comic books. Because of the way that like they're printed and laid out on the page, even whenever they translate them to American, they still to English. they still you still have to flip through them like from a like backwards from the other side.
Yeah, I had no idea. But so going back to the graphic novels though, so graphic novel is just it's a comic book, but everything, the story comes out all at once, and has a beginning and an end.
Yes,
it's
a super long comic book that tells a complete story.
Okay, so but like for saying it's Batman, that doesn't really have an end.
Right, unless so they do have some Batman graphic novels, but the graphic novel wouldn't be part of a ongoing story as a whole. It'd be like its own little side adventure type thing that takes place by itself. So we'll get into some examples of all of them, and it's actually cool, JP, that you've never read a comic book in your life, because we will be reading some. We're going to be covering Superman is kind of my plan for the first superhero that we cover, and I got some good Superman comics that we could dive into whenever that time comes. So let's get into a brief history of comic books, okay? So they separated out into different ages. JP, when do you think like superhero comic books first started coming out? When do you think?
Like, what decade?
Yeah, sure.
1940s.
Close. So technically, the golden age of comic books is said to have started in 1938. This was kind of the birth of like Superman, and Batman came a little bit after, and but the golden age of superheroes, they were supposed to be like inspirational and perfect heroes. So Superman's the perfect example of a golden age superhero, right? He's not supposed to be relatable. He's not supposed to be realistic. He's just like the man, To Captain America also, because he's like, he's perfect. He's Captain America. They're pretty much like, these guys are idealistic, they're patriotic, and they're pretty square. Like they fit into the, this is what a hero looks like type thing, right? That went on from 1938 to 1956. And then you get into the Silver Age, okay? So 1956 to 1970. Try to think of 56 to 70. What kind of global event was starting to happen at that time, 1956 to 1970?
Well, you have different things. I mean, yeah,
global
Vietnam.
Event. Global.
Well, you have Vietnam.
Uh-huh.
That's, I guess, in the late.
No, the Vietnam hasn't started.
I don't know if it started in the mid '60s or late '60s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have hippies. Started around that time. You have the space race. That's
There you
going on
go.
around
Yeah.
that time.
So you had the space race and the Cold War, and these actually really influenced the Silver Age. So the space race was huge because something else we can get into another time. But if you look at like horror movies in the 50s, those turned into science fiction movies. So it became all about aliens are invading Earth and all that stuff, and people were afraid of outer space and aliens and stuff. So same thing happened with superheroes, is they started bringing in a bunch of, science fiction and outer space type stuff. Like Spider-Man is a kind of a classic Silver Age hero because he got his powers from science. It was a freak, scientific experiment, right?
I think he's got bit by a spider.
Well,
Wasn't that?
A mutated spider that's created by, science. And so a lot of the heroes.
So that's what happened. I thought in the movie, Tobey Maguire just hangs out in some lab and a little spider bites his finger.
Yeah. What do they do in a lab, Nick?
Man, I don't
Science. They do science in a lab, Nick.
Science is the answer to superheroes.
Yes.
Like,
but that's like in the Silver Age, science is what it is. In the Golden Age, it's just like magic. Like these heroes are just magical superheroes.
so they have like wizards and stuff. Like,
Yeah, they got wizards. So one of them, Shazam, right? Did y'all see Shazam? That movie?
Yeah.
No.
Wait.
So-
Is that the one with Shaq?
No.
No.
That's Kazam. the one-
Kazam. Oh, Shazam.
he's
okay.
The genie.
That's Shazam.
No,
I don't know if I've seen that.
Shazam that just came out. The superhero.
Oh no, I didn't see that.
Okay.
I thought that was a remake of Kazam.
Oh, my God. Nick, did you see Shazam?
no,
Well-
but I saw the Shaq movie back in the day.
Oh my God. Well, Shazam is a classic example of a superhero where so a wizard gives the superhero his powers. A wizard just gives him his powers. That's how he gets them. So
How's a wizard get his powers in the first place?
because he's a wizard, JP. He's a wizard. But yeah, I mean that's the big difference between Golden Age and Silver Age is that. And also the Silver Age comics are really weird and over the top because like Batman, right? He was invented in the Golden Age of superheroes, but
So they send him to space for
yeah,
fun.
exactly. He gets like a bat spaceship and goes to Mars and fights the Martians and stuff like that.
That's so weird.
Yeah, exactly. That's the Silver Age.
All right.
And then you come into the Bronze Age. This is 1970 to 1986. And so most of the stuff that comic book fans will start reading starts with this. Because this is when so this was like the wake of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, right? So like the hippies and the civil rights movement and stuff like that kind of changed culture in America a lot. So those are the types of stories that people liked to read. The superhero stories were a bit grittier. The superheroes weren't like perfect. They had problems. For example, Green Arrow. Do y'all know who that is? Green Arrow?
I don't know who the Green Lantern is. I don't know who the Green Arrow is.
Nick, do you know who
No,
Green Arrow is?
I've heard of Green Arrow, but
He's
I
like
haven't.
He's like Robin Hood, basically, or he's kind of like a different version of Batman. He's this rich guy who has a bow and arrow and fights crime and stuff. But he kind of looks like Robin Hood. But he has a sidekick named Speedy, and back in the Bronze Age, Speedy got addicted to heroin. Yeah, and so it's like a cautionary tale against drug use.
He was just trying to slow down, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just chill out, mellow out, dude, with some heroin. And the
Don't do drugs, kids.
Don't do drugs. Correct. X-Men. Okay, X-Men. These guys were created in the Silver Age, right? Because they're mutants, right? But one of the things that makes X-Men kind of interesting is that they're basically like a metaphor for racism, right? It's like people don't like mutants; they're afraid of them. So so they're kind of like a, what do you call it? Like a scapegoat, like people blame all their problems on them. And so X-Men, even though they're created in the 60s, they were kind of rebooted in the 70s as this metaphor for racial issues. And also like issues with kids not being understood by their parents and stuff like that. I mean, that was a really big thing in this day because, parents thought that their kids were fine, but then the kids turned out to be hippies. Right?
Not that there's nothing wrong with hippies.
Also, you have a lot more diversity in superheroes. They kind of finally started making heroes that weren't just white. So that's when you get characters like Luke Cage. Then also they made the Green Lantern, who used to be a white guy named Hal Jordan. They made him a black character named John Stewart. So, they just kind of started adding diversity in their comics and all that stuff. But also at the same time, storylines became darker. Spider-Man accidentally kills his girlfriend.
Oh, wow. Which girlfriend was that?
That was Gwen Stacy.
Gwen Stacy.
Yes.
Stacy.
How did he kill her?
So I think it was the Green Goblin pushed her out a window or dropped her off a building, and he tried to save her with his spider web, but it ended up like wrapping around her neck and snapping it. So,
oh dang, wow. That's pretty dark.
Yeah, exactly. And like, yeah, that story arc was called the Death of Gwen Stacy, though, and it was kind of like a big deal at that time because comics hadn't gotten real like that very often. Okay, so next you get into the modern age of comics. So that's from 1986 to the present, and this is the age where basically the only people who were reading comics at this point were grown nerds. Basically, that's kind of the shift for comic books, either grown nerds or teenagers. Back in these days, that's when comics get like super like serious and edgy, and that's when graphic novels became a big thing. But the big examples of the modern age comic books are Watchmen, a Batman comic called The Dark Knight Returns, and we'll read that eventually for the show. But it's all about appealing to older demographics because this has kind of become the target population of comic books. They're not really targeted towards kids that much anymore. But that's pretty much the history. That takes us from the beginning all the way up to today. So those are the ages. We got golden, silver, bronze, and the modern age.
I don't know. I think when it comes to we've already gone over. I've never read any of these, but when it comes to seeing the movies, I like the serious comics more. I feel like.
Yeah, so like The Dark Knight, right?
Yes, I love The Dark Knight. That's one of my favorites.
The worst example nowadays is like Batman versus Superman. Worst movie, not the worst movie, one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. Did y'all see it?
That's pretty. No, I didn't. But I heard bad things.
I didn't watch it because I didn't hear good things about it. And
but talking about Batman versus Superman, I'm kind of shifting gears here a little bit. But because I know that's like a big rivalry in the DC universe, and haven't they told that story several times?
Yeah.
What I don't get is how in the world does Superman lose to Batman? Because Batman's just some rich dude who knows kung fu, and he goes, "Hey, Superman, I got this rock from your planet that kills you." And he's like, "Let me beat you up." And Superman goes, "No, the stone." And then that's it. I'm like, man, Superman would destroy Bruce Wayne in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Like, it makes zero sense.
Like if Batman's got the rock, it's got kryptonite. Why didn't Superman just fly across the world and then like shoot him with his laser eyes or something like that? Like it should be easy.
I mean, I get it. I mean, that's not a very good story. It's not worth reading.
Maybe they shouldn't tell that story.
It makes a lot more sense than Batman punching him up a few times and going, "Hey, guess what? I got this rock."
Well, y'all know in so Batman versus Superman. Nick, you might have seen this on the internet. the thing that resolves their conflict.
Wonder Woman pops
No.
up and they're like, "Yo, man, she's pretty good looking.
No.
Let's split our differences."
It's that Superman's Superman's mom's name is Martha. Do you know what Batman's mom's name is?
Martha?
Martha.
Oh my gosh.
Their moms had the same name.
They bond over that.
Exactly.
Wait, so you're
Oh,
saying
dear
this is in the
Lord.
comics?
No, this is in the movie.
Oh.
This movie's stupid.
Wait, I thought one of them was killed though.
No, that was in. Well, yeah. Okay, so they joined forces. Wait, no. Who dies? Yeah, Superman dies in the movie. They join forces to beat the bad guy though at the end, which and then Superman gets killed.
Okay. Here's part of the reason why I have a trouble with all these comics and superheroes. I want one true storyline. There are too many dang storylines.
So you're never gonna get that. That's one thing that I hate about it too. Is it's really complicated and confusing. I always kind of saw sports and comics as being similar in that it's very hard to know how to get into it and to jump in because like if you're already behind, it's not.
Yeah, but but you're talking about you have all these different storylines and it can be frustrating. And while I agree, I also think that's actually pretty cool because say you're a huge Batman or Spider-Man fan, there's so many different storylines tied to that one character. So it's almost like you're watching a sequel to your favorite movie,
Yeah.
And it's different variations. So
Yeah.
I can see why it's really cool, but it is hard to jump into because it could seem overwhelming.
Yeah.
But in the same vein, I think it's pretty cool because there's countless stories of your favorite characters.
Yeah, that's true. Because say that you like Batman, but you don't like the super dark stuff, you can kind of, find the thing that fits you best. And I feel like nowadays, especially, there's a really big diversity in comics, and I feel like there's really something for everyone. So let's get into talking about the main comic book publishers, okay? JP, do you know the two main comic book publishers at least? Do you know
Yes,
that?
I do. And maybe 5 years ago I didn't know this, but because of all the movies and everything coming out, that's the only reason I know it. We have Marvel and DC.
Correct. Okay, so who are the big DC heroes?
There we have Batman, we have Superman,
Right.
and that's all I really know.
Okay.
Of the DC.
Okay. Well, I'll.
And then like everybody else, like I feel like at least when it comes to movies, everybody's Marvel. I mean, also the Avengers movie also did just come out, so. So
Well,
I'm a lot, I guess, more familiar with the Marvel characters.
Well, okay. So Wonder Woman is a DC character. You know who Wonder Woman is, right?
Yes.
Do you know who the Flash is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Green Lantern, also DC.
Heard of him.
All right. So we'll get into. Oh yeah.
And they're the Justice League. Right?
They're the Justice League. Very good.
Yes.
Yes. You also have Aquaman.
Aquaman. I did not know that.
Yeah. And you also have you got some others in there too. That's as deep as we'll go though, for as far as heroes go. Now, so DC was founded in 1934. It was called National Allied Publications. They became DC Comics in 1977 as a tribute to their best-selling comic, Detective Comics, which is actually the comic book in which Batman was started. Now,
Was he originally a detective?
yes,
or?
and he kind of so there's like a bit of a debate about Batman because in the comic book community, oftentimes people forget that Batman was originally supposed to be a detective, right? He solves crimes. He goes to the crime scene, investigates, and tracks down the criminal and captures them, puts them in jail. That's kind of Batman's formula. Because there was these comic books called Detective Comics back in the day that they had Batman stories in them, but he wasn't the only character. They also had the hard-boiled detective, he's gonna rescue a dame from distress and all that stuff. And so those are the types of stories that were in there, but Batman was obviously the most popular one because he's a detective that wears a freaking bat costume. Then you also had Action Comics back in the day. That's where Superman started, okay? So Action Comics didn't just have Superman stories in them. They also had like war stories and like spy stories and all that stuff, but Superman was obviously the most popular thing, so eventually they just became Superman Comics. Now, the brand of DC heroes, the thing that separates them from Marvel heroes is that the DC heroes are inspired by mythology a lot. Bigger-than-life characters. Superman is like Hercules. Wonder Woman is like the Amazon warriors from Greek mythology. You got the Flash, who's like Hermes, the god with the wings on his feet. Aquaman is like Poseidon. You got Batman, who's like Hades, right? Like the underworld. And then also Shazam, we mentioned him earlier. His name is literally an acronym, spells out Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, wow. Mercury. So Shazam, there you go. So that's kind of the thing that identifies DC heroes the most, is that they're these big, grand, epic characters. Yeah. Whereas Marvel characters are supposed to be more relatable, right? They're regular people who, like Peter Parker, right? He's a regular kid, gets bit by a spider, now he's a superhero, and he's special, right? So there you go. And that kind of brings us to Marvel. Nick, you were going to take us away with Marvel, right?
Yeah, definitely. So just a little history on Marvel. It was originally founded in 1939 as Timely Comics, or also known as Timely Publications, by Martin Goodman.
Good man.
Yeah, he's a good man. Did a lot of good work. And then it became Atlas Comics in the 1950s and was eventually known as Marvel Comics in 1961. And even though they were, back in the day when they were known as Timely Comics, the first issue ever released was known as Marvel Comics #1. And it starred the Human Torch.
Wow.
And JP, do you know who the Human Torch is?
The Human Torch? No.
Have you heard of the Fantastic Four?
Yeah, okay, so that...
Yeah, he's the guy who goes, flame on, and then he flies around, and it's basically fire.
Yeah, I just saw the first Fantastic Four movie, but I remember him, yes.
Yeah, he was played by Chris Evans, right?
Yeah, Captain America.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and some other timely comic superheroes that came out in that time. There was Neror, I guess. I think that's how you say his name. The Submariner, and Captain America. Those were the most successful heroes from that time. Some other characters were Miss America, the Destroyer, Vision, and Angel. And probably the superhero with the most unfortunate name, the Wizard.
The Wizard.
No, the Wizard.
What's his power?
The Wizard.
Basically, he's the Flash.
Okay.
Does he pee on people?
No, but I was like, what did this guy do? I mean, to get this unfortunate name.
But how about the zipper? Oh, the zipper. It's bad too.
There should only be the Flash, and that's it. Just don't mirror the Flash. But when Timely changed to Atlas, that was about the like I said, 1950s. People lost interest in superheroes, so Atlas started publishing more westerns and war stories and romance and espionage, and even a few medieval adventures as well.
I'd forgotten to mention that kind of towards the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of the Silver Age, people weren't super into superhero comics, and so that's when you get a lot of those like old science fiction and horror comics and stuff from that time.
Yeah. They just wanted to shift. I mean, and also, think about it. It's coming off. It was a little bit after the Second World War. People's were changing priorities, and all this stuff was happening in the world. So their attention's focused to other endeavors. I guess. But in 1961, that's when Stan Lee kind of came around, and he started making superheroes more human. Deets, you talked about this a little bit. They started having problems of their own. You had Peter Parker, who was Spider-Man, and he was in high school. He's like, I got this biology test today, but I also got to fight the Green Goblin at 3:30. Stuff like that. And and then you deal with. There's had these different character flaws as well, so they wouldn't seem so idealistic. They seemed flawed, and they were a lot more relatable. And that's also kind of when a lot of these Marvel superheroes that we are really familiar with started coming around as well. Some of the main ones, basically, if you've seen an Avenger movie, the main.
JP, name the famous Marvel heroes besides the characters in the Avengers and Spider-Man. Name a few.
Besides the one in Avengers and Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to do because the Avengers. That brings everybody basically together.
I don't know. Yeah, all I know, like Spider-Man and then Captain America, Thor, all them. But they're in the movie, so I don't know anybody else.
X-Men.
Oh, okay, X-Men. Yes, I always forget about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're Marvel, and then you have. I mean, there's so many X-Men in that series, but then you also have some other fun facts. You have Men in Black. That was a Marvel comic before.
I didn't know
That's
that.
crazy. Wow.
Yeah, Men in Black. That was I think it was a limited series, but it was a Marvel
That's cool.
comic. And then Blade,
Yep, Blade.
Deadpool, the Fantastic Four, and then basically all of the Avengers people, the Punisher, and then you have supervillains like Doctor Doom.
Oh, and
Green
Doctor
Goblin.
Who. I always forget, but he's in the.
No, Doctor Doom.
Who
Yeah,
is
but
not-
isn't Doctor Who in the Avengers movie?
No, that's Doctor
No,
Strange.
that's its own thing.
Oh yeah, okay. But isn't there Doctor Who?
That's a TV show.
Oh gosh.
But hey, that's kind of on topic,
Doctor
sort of.
Strange.
We'll cover Doctor Who at some point in the podcast.
Yeah.
as
And then you
well.
have Venom, Magneto, and all those good stuff. All those good guys or bad guys rather. Good guys, bad guys. It's all the same. What else? Oh yeah, another little thing I thought was interesting. So, the Comics Code Authority, it was formed in 1954, and it was put in place to kind of regulate and rate the comics. So you could know, okay, this comic is for maybe a little bit more mature audience. This one's for kids. So it helps with that kind of how there's the ESRB for video games and the movie rating scale. That's the point of that, basically.
Okay.
But in 2001, Marvel actually broke away from the CCA, and they went on and created their own rating. And at this rating system, and at this time, they launched Max Comics. It was targeted more towards a mature audience, and it featured uncensored content. It was more violent, and I don't know if they still make those comics anymore, but yeah, they were a lot more mature.
More
I don't know.
extreme.
Yeah, pretty
Do you know when that was?
nudity.
Do you know when that was that they started that?
Around 2001, because that's when they got away
Okay.
from the. And then I looked online. I think the last Max comic issue that was out might have been in 2013, but I'm not sure.
And I think
I think it's discontinued, but I can't say with 100%.
I want to say that they had because they would have characters, like regular Marvel characters, but they would do Max comics for them, they had a
Right,
Punisher
yeah,
Max series where.
Yeah, and there was Nick Fury had his own Max series, and I saw that Stan Lee, who created Nick Fury, he wasn't a fan because it was just a little too much.
Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is indie comics. You have these two comic book publishers that are huge, but there's a bunch of smaller comic book companies that I want to acknowledge real quick, because back in the 80s and 90s, like in the modern comic book era, smaller comic book companies ended up kind of popping up. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was originally a comic book published by a independent company called Mirage Studios in 1984, which is a big deal because the Ninja Turtles became a huge hit, and it kind of proved that artists could independently produce comics and be successful. Okay, so this was in 84. After that, Dark Horse was founded in 1986. Their kind of most famous, comics are Hellboy. Also, they published Sin City and 300. Y'all probably saw that, one of those two movies.
Wow.
Seen
Yep.
both of them. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Also, The Mask was originally a Dark Horse comic.
Oh, really?
Oh
Jim
yeah,
Carrey.
I love that movie.
And
I didn't realize he had his own
yeah,
comic.
and I've seen images from them. They look pretty wild, but I haven't read any of them. And then you have they have some licensed franchises like Buffy the Vampire Slayer is kind of interesting to point out because after the show was taken off the air, the creator of the show, Joss Whedon, he helped write this comic book series that continued the show. So it's like the show was not on TV anymore, but the next seasons of the show were in comic book form, which is kind of
That's pretty
yeah.
cool. I mean, because I know there's so many shows that you want to know what keeps happening after the fact, and that's pretty cool that they have that freedom to do so.
Yeah. Also, the Star Wars comics were published by Dark Horse for a long time before Disney purchased Star Wars. Now, Marvel publishes Star Wars because Marvel is also owned by Disney. And the Star Wars comics nowadays, I've read some of the newer ones. They're actually pretty good. Those are the Marvel series, though. Then you got Image Comics. This was founded in 1992. Now, a lot of those super violent, extreme comics that I got were Image Comics. The guys who founded Image had worked for Marvel and DC, and they kind of got tired of kind of being
Same old.
Yeah, and kind of Marvel would tell them what to do all the time. And let's say they would create a character, okay, this guy named Todd McFarlane created Venom, the Spider-Man villain.
Not Billy McFarlane?
No, nor Seth MacFarlane. Todd McFarlane. He created Venom for Spider-Man, but he was not allowed. He wouldn't be able to use Venom if he were to create his own comic, right? So he created the character. He should be able to create his own spin-off comic if he wanted to, but Marvel wouldn't let him. So he went off and helped create the company Image, and he created the character of Spawn. And that was that's his thing. He completely owns the rights to Spawn and can do whatever he wants for that character. Did y'all ever see that movie back in the 90s?
What,
yeah,
Spawn?
It was
bad.
Wasn't Martin Sheen like the main bad guy?
Martin Sheen was the bad, and then John Leguizamo was the that clown dude.
Oh yeah.
It was a weird movie.
Yeah.
But Spawn's a pretty iconic character though. Just essential like 90s badass superhero.
Yeah, just watching the movie, I mean, he was actually a really interesting character, and he had a pretty cool backstory.
Yeah.
But the movie was pretty bad.
Yeah. And they've been trying to. Supposedly, I think that McFarlane is directing a Spawn movie that's going to be coming out sometime in the future. Who knows? Also, Walking Dead was published by Image. And then also the Savage Dragon. Do y'all remember that from back in the day? They had a TV show. Also.
I've heard of Snapdragon,
Snapdragon.
but I think that's a different thing.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, Savage Dragon. That was one of the more successful titles back in the day. And then you got the publishing company IDW. They were founded in 1999. Their big titles, 30 Days of Night. They came out with the movie version of that a while back ago. Comics are pretty good. And then Lock and Key, which is actually, Nick, you'll like this. Do you know who Joe Hill is?
Can't say that I do.
Joe Hill? He's Stephen King's son.
Okay.
And he actually writes some pretty decent horror books, but he wrote this comic book series, Lock and Key. It's pretty good. And then you got Archie Comics. I'll mention them real quick. They've been around forever. Y'all know Archie Comics, right?
No, I've never heard of them.
No.
You never heard of Archie Comics?
No, neither has Nick.
No,
Yeah, neither has Nick.
I think of like, what's his name? Archie Bunker? Wasn't he like on some show?
You know, like Betty and Veronica and like Jughead and all that?
Are these just family
Jughead.
members you're talking about? Like Betty and Veronica?
Oh my
we
God.
also got Susan.
No,
So,
no.
okay, we'll have to do an episode on Archie, but
Never heard of the
so
guy.
disappointed in y'all.
Sounds like a cool guy.
They got the new TV show on the CW, Riverdale.
Riverdance?
Riverdale.
Dude, I love the Riverdance. Back in music class, we used to watch that.
Y'all the worst. Well, moving on, we got also a thing called alternative comics. This isn't a publishing company, but this is a kind of a genre of comic books that I wanted to mention. Like in the 80s, these kind of artsy, hipster comics started being created. Big examples is like the graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Actually, I own that. I think it would be cool to do for the show, but I don't know if it'd be appropriate for like nerd culture. But these comics are basically about like real world stuff. They're not about superheroes. They're usually either like super grounded. Like there's this other one that I have called Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Boy on Earth. And it sounds like it's about a superhero or something like that, but it's actually just about like this sad middle-aged man who meets his father for the first time, and it's like really awkward. And that's what the whole graphic novel is about. There's also 8 Ball by Dan Clowes. It makes you kind of look at comics differently if you see like grounded, realistic stories.
No, I think that's pretty cool because I think with these comics, it's obviously expanding the medium, you know,
Exactly.
And it's not just saying, oh, we're all about Superman and Spider-Man and just superheroes. It's like, hey, we can tell these deep and interesting stories without having magic and aliens and stuff like that. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, and they say, you know, whenever you say you want comics to be like grown up and mature and all that stuff, to me, mature isn't having like murder on every page.
Right.
It's kind of, you know, being more emotionally mature, I guess, rather than just, you know.
No, that's pretty cool. I wasn't aware of these, and I think it's pretty neat.
No, they're pretty good. I got some more to recommend to you if you want some other time. But So that's comics in a nutshell. Hope you guys are walking away with a little bit more knowledge in your brain.
Yeah, that was very educational. I had no idea about most of that stuff that you're talking about.
In future episodes, I do want to dive into some characters. Like, I do want to have an episode dedicated entirely to Batman or to Superman, but that's kind of the general rundown. Obviously, we need to do a episode on Archie comics as well now, since you guys don't know. However, listeners, I hope you enjoyed the show. We're going to be back in your podcast feed next Friday. We're going to be talking about a thing called Star Wars, the original trilogy.
Man, that sounds so nerdy.
That sounds very nerdy. That is the name of the show. But in the meantime, give us a like on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and subscribe to us if you haven't yet on your podcasting platform of choice. And of course, send us an email at winerdcast@gmail.com if you have questions, comments, or concerns. With that being said, I am your host, Tyler Dietz. I'm here with JP Cochran and Nick Grant, and we're going to see you guys next Friday.